The picture most people have of a medieval banquet is a bit of a mess. Huge roasts of meat. People tearing at it with their hands, throwing bones over their shoulder for the dogs. Wine sloshing out of goblets. It's a scene of loud, happy, and slightly gross indulgence. And in that picture, there are no forks. For the most part, that picture is pretty accurate. The fork, as we know it, was not a part of the average medieval person's life, or even a king's life, for that matter. So, what did they use? The answer is simple. They used their hands, a spoon, and a knife. That was the standard set of tools for eating for hundreds of years. It sounds primitive to us now, but back then, it was all they needed, and there was a whole system of etiquette built around it. Let's start with the knife. The knife was the most personal and important tool. Most men and many women carried their own knife with them everywhere. It wasn't just for eating, it was a multi-tool. You'd use it to cut your food, of course. But you'd also use it to cut rope, mend a tool, or defend yourself if you had to. Because it was a personal item, you were responsible for it. You kept it sharp and clean. At a meal, you'd use your knife to cut off a piece of meat from the main platter or from the slab of meat you were given. Then you'd use your fingers to lift that piece to your mouth. You might also use the tip of the knife to spear a piece of food, but this was more like a quick stab and lift, not like the way we use a fork today. It was a cutting tool first and foremost. Next was the spoon. Spoons were common. They were essential for eating anything liquid, like soups, stews, or pottage. Pottage was a thick vegetable and grain stew that was a staple food for almost everyone, rich and poor. Because you couldn't eat that with your hands or a knife, spoons were made from all sorts of materials. A poor peasant would have a spoon carved from wood or horn. A wealthy lord might have a spoon made of silver. Unlike the personal knife, spoons were often shared, especially at a lower class table. A host would provide spoons for their guests. They were a bit more of a household item than a personal one. And then there were the hands. This is the part that seems strangest to us, but eating with your hands in the Middle Ages was not a free-for-all. There were rules, lots of them. Manners were incredibly important, especially in a noble court. They were a way to show you were civilized and not a brute. First, you always washed your hands before a meal. A servant would come around with a pitcher of water, often scented with herbs, and a basin for you to wash in, along with a towel for drying. This wasn't just about hygiene, it was a ritual. When you ate, you were supposed to use only your right hand. The left hand was considered unclean and was used for other, less savory personal tasks. You also used only the tips of your first 3 fingers to pick up food. You didn't grab things with your whole fist. It was meant to be a delicate, clean process. You were not supposed to put all your fingers in your mouth, just the food. You had to keep your hands as clean as possible during the meal. Dipping your fingers into a shared bowl required that those fingers be clean. Double dipping was a serious breach of etiquette. The food itself was served in a way that made it easy to eat with this system. Meat was often pre-cut into smaller pieces after being carved, or it was cooked until it was so tender it could be pulled apart easily. People didn't eat off individual plates the way we do. Instead, they used something called a trencher. A trencher was a thick slice of stale bread, usually a day or 2 old. You'd put your portion of meat and other solid foods onto the trencher. The bread would soak up the juices from the meat and gravy. At the end of the meal, you could eat your trencher if you were still hungry. Or, more often, it was given to the poor or to the dogs waiting on the floor. The very rich might have trenchers made of wood or a type of metal called pewter, but the bread trencher was the most common. This whole system worked. People ate, and they had a complex social code that governed how they ate. The knife cut, the spoon scooped, and the fingers lifted. There was no real need for another tool. Bringing a fork into this well-established system wasn't just unnecessary, it was disruptive. It was a solution to a problem that nobody thought they had. So when the fork did start to appear, it wasn't welcomed with open arms. It was seen as strange, foreign, and deeply suspicious. Its journey to the European table would be a very long and difficult one. The fork didn't just appear out of nowhere. It had a home. And that home was the Byzantine Empire, the eastern part of the old Roman Empire, with its capital in Constantinople. The Byzantines were seen by Western Europeans as incredibly sophisticated, but also as soft, decadent, and a bit untrustworthy. Their culture was a blend of Greek, Roman, and Middle Eastern influences, and their court was famous for its luxury and elaborate ceremony. And it was in this environment that the small personal eating fork first came into use among the nobility. To a medieval knight from France or England, the idea of using a small 2-pronged tool to bring food to your mouth was bizarre. Why would you need such a thing? God gave you hands and fingers. They were the natural tools for eating. To use an artificial instrument like a fork seemed, to some, like an insult to God. It was a sign of vanity, an unnecessary luxury that suggested you thought your hands were too good to touch your food. The suspicion of the fork is perfectly captured in a story from the 11th century. A Byzantine princess named Theodora Dukaina married Domenico Selvo, the leader of Venice. Venice had strong trade ties with the Byzantine Empire, so this marriage made political sense. But Theodora brought her Byzantine customs with her, and one of them was her set of golden forks. She refused to eat with her hands. She had a servant cut her food into tiny pieces, which she would then pick up with her little golden fork and delicately place in her mouth. The Venetians were horrified. They saw it as an act of incredible arrogance and sinfulness. One church leader, Peter Damian, wrote about her with contempt. He saw her use of the fork as a sign of her moral corruption. When the princess later died of a terrible plague, he claimed it was God's punishment for her vanity. And he wrote that her body literally rotted away before her death as a just reward for her excessive delicacy. The fork, in his eyes, was not just a tool, it was a symbol of sin and a rejection of the natural order. This attitude was common across Europe for centuries. The fork was associated with everything that medieval Western Europeans distrusted about the East. It was seen as effeminate. Real men, warriors, and knights ate with their hands and their knives. They tore at their meat. Using a dainty little fork was seen as something a woman, or a man who was not properly masculine, would do. The tool itself was small and sharp, and some even compared it to the devil's pitchfork, a miniature instrument of evil brought to the holy act of sharing a meal. The fork also faced a practical problem. The early forks weren't very good. They typically had only two straight, sharp tines. They were decent for pinning down a piece of meat to cut it, but they were not very effective for scooping. You couldn't eat peas with a two-pronged fork. You couldn't get much gravy or sauce with it. It was really only good for spearing solid chunks of food. A spoon was better for liquids, and fingers were better for picking up most solid foods. So, for many people, the fork seemed not only weird and sinful, but also not very useful. So, for hundreds of years, the fork remained an object of curiosity and scorn. It was an Italian thing, a Byzantine affectation. If an English or French nobleman saw one, he might laugh at it. It was a toy for the over-refined, a sign that its user was more concerned with appearances than with honest, hearty eating. It would take a profound shift in how people thought about food, manners, and the body itself before the fork could even begin to find a place at the European table. It had to overcome religious suspicion, cultural prejudice, and simple, practical inertia. The old ways were comfortable. The knife, spoon, and hands worked just fine. The fork had a long uphill battle to fight. So if people weren't eating with forks, does that mean the tool didn't exist at all in medieval Europe? Not exactly. The idea of a long handle with prongs on the end was not new, but its function was completely different. The fork that existed in the medieval kitchen or at the high table of a great hall was not a piece of personal cutlery. It was a serving tool, a piece of kitchen equipment. Imagine a huge roaring fire in the kitchen of a castle. A massive pot of stew is bubbling away. A cook needs to pull out a large piece of meat or a root vegetable from the boiling water. He's not going to stick his hand in there. He would use a large, long-handled fork. This kitchen fork was a beast. It might be 2 or 3 feet long, made of iron, with 2 or 3 thick, sharp tines. It was a heavy-duty tool built for lifting heavy things out of hot places. It was a tool of the cook, not the diner. Another place you would see a fork-like instrument was at the carving station. In a wealthy household, serving a roast was a form of theater. A high-ranking servant, known as the carver, had the honored job of cutting the meat in front of the Lord and his guests. It was a display of skill and grace. The carver would use a very long, very sharp carving knife. To hold the hot, greasy roast steady while he sliced it, he would use a carving fork. Like the kitchen fork, this was a large 2-pronged tool. It was used to pin the meat to the cutting board. It never went anywhere near a person's mouth. Its job was to help prepare the food for others, who would then eat it with their hands. These early forks were tools for holding, securing, and transporting food during its preparation and serving. They were part of the behind-the-scenes work of a meal, even if that work, like carving, was performed in public. The distinction is crucial. Using a big fork to hold down a pig for carving was seen as perfectly normal and masculine. Using a tiny fork to lift a small piece of that same pig to your mouth was seen as ridiculous and unmanly. The scale and the context were everything. These serving forks were also used for things that had little to do with eating. People would use them to toast bread over a fire. They were also used in farming and other trades. The pitchfork, used for moving hay, is just a very large version of the same basic design. The concept of prongs on a stick was useful for many things. Lifting food to the mouth just wasn't one of them. Some very wealthy people, especially in Italy starting in the later Middle Ages, might have had a small fork as part of a set for eating specific messy foods. For example, some accounts mention using a small fork to eat preserved fruits and sticky syrup. This was a way to keep your fingers from getting dirty, but this was an exception, not the rule. It was a specialized tool for a specific problem, used only by the very rich who could afford such luxuries. It was not a general-purpose eating utensil. For a regular meal of bread, cheese, and pottage, or even a feast of roast chicken and pies, a fork was simply not on the table. The existence of these large functional forks shows that people were not ignorant of the design. They just didn't see it as something for personal use at the table. The barrier was not technological, it was cultural. They had the ability to make small forks, they just didn't want them. The mental leap required to shrink the big, brutish kitchen fork into a small, elegant personal tool and then put it in your mouth was a leap most medieval people were not willing or able to make. The fork had its place, and that place was in the hands of a cook or a carver, not in the hands of a king at his dinner. Before it could make that journey, society's ideas about cleanliness, status, and the very act of eating had to change completely. The fork's fortunes began to change in one specific place, Italy. During the late Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance, from the 14th century onwards, Italy was a place of immense change. It was a collection of wealthy city-states like Venice, Florence, and Genoa. These cities were centers of trade, art, and new ideas. And it was here that the personal eating fork finally found a culture that was ready for it. There were a few key reasons for this. First, Italy had always maintained stronger ties with the Byzantine Empire than the rest of Western Europe. The fork was never as alien in Italy as it was in France or England. Venetian traders saw it in use in Constantinople. It was a known, if rare, object. Second, the Renaissance brought a new way of thinking. There was a growing interest in refinement, elegance, and personal cleanliness. The wealthy merchant class wanted to distinguish themselves from the old, rough-mannered feudal nobility. Adopting new, more civilized table manners was a perfect way to do that. Using a fork was a sign that you were sophisticated, modern, and rich. But perhaps the most important reason for the fork's rise in Italy was a practical one: pasta. While pasta existed in various forms throughout the Middle Ages, it became increasingly popular and was served with slippery, liquid sauces. Trying to eat a mouthful of spaghetti or noodles with a spoon was a clumsy affair. Trying to eat it with your hands was a disaster. It was messy and difficult. The fork, however, was the perfect tool for the job. You could spear the pasta, or as the design evolved, you could twirl it. The fork solved a real practical problem presented by a popular Italian food. This gave it a purpose that it lacked in the roast meat and bread trencher cultures of Northern Europe. So, in the homes of wealthy Italians, the personal fork started to become a regular feature of the table setting. At first, it was still a status symbol. A host would provide a set of matching forks and spoons for his guests, all made of silver, to show off his wealth. Having a personal fork was a sign that you were at the cutting edge of fashion and taste. Etiquette books began to appear, instructing people on the proper way to use this new tool. The fork was no longer just a weird foreign object, it was becoming a part of Italian identity. Even in Italy, the adoption was slow. It started with the upper classes and gradually trickled down. And the rest of Europe still looked on with amusement and suspicion. They saw it as a theatrical Italian affectation. A French or German visitor to Italy in the 15th or 16th century would have written home about the strange local custom of eating with a small pronged device. They would have found it fussy and unnecessary. The design of the fork also began to change during this time. The old two-pronged model was good for spearing, but not much else. Italian craftsmen started experimenting. They added a third tine and later a fourth. They also began to give the tines a slight curve. This new design was much more versatile. The curve made the fork function a bit like a spoon, allowing you to scoop up food like peas or rice. The extra tines made it easier to pick up smaller pieces of food. This improved design made the fork a much more useful and practical tool, capable of replacing the fingers for almost every task. By the end of the medieval period and the height of the Renaissance, the fork was firmly established among the Italian elite. It was part of a broader cultural shift towards what we would now consider modern table manners. This shift valued a greater distance between the person and the food. Touching food with your hands was starting to be seen as less refined. The fork was a tool that created that distance. It was a barrier between the body and the meal, a symbol of a new kind of civilization. But this was still just an Italian story. For the fork to conquer the world, it would have to leave Italy and begin its slow, difficult journey across the Alps. The fork was an Italian success story by the 16th century, but the rest of Europe was slow to catch on. The journey of the fork from Italy to the dining tables of France, England, and beyond was a slow crawl, met with resistance and ridicule every step of the way. It took centuries for the fork to become the standard utensil we know today. By the time it did, the Middle Ages were a distant memory. France was one of the next countries to flirt with the fork, largely due to the Italian influence on its culture. Catherine de' Medici, an Italian noblewoman who became Queen of France in 1547, is often credited with introducing the fork to the French court. While it's a good story, it's not entirely true. The fork was known in France before she arrived, but it was still seen as an eccentric Italian novelty. Her arrival, along with her Italian entourage, certainly made the fork more visible, but it was still considered an affectation. French noblemen thought it was pretentious and silly. King Louis XIV of France, who reigned in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, preferred to eat with his hands and forbade his children from using the forks that had started to become fashionable. The fork's reception in England was even colder. In the early 1600s, an English traveler named Thomas Coryat visited Italy and became accustomed to using a fork. He was so taken with the custom that he brought it back to England with him. He used his fork in public, thinking he was introducing a civilized new habit to his countrymen. He was brutally mocked for it. People laughed at him. They called him furcifer, a Latin word that meant fork-bearer, but also sounded like scoundrel. His use of the fork was seen as un-English, unmanly, and absurdly pretentious. The resistance was fierce. Like Peter Damian hundreds of years earlier, many English preachers declared that using a fork was an insult to God, who gave us fingers for eating. So what changed? Why did the fork eventually win? The process was gradual and driven by the same forces that had made it popular in Italy, a growing concern for refinement and hygiene. As the 17th and 18th centuries progressed, the upper classes across Europe became more and more interested in creating a civilized society, and that included table manners. The idea of everyone at the table dipping their greasy fingers into the same serving dish started to seem less communal and more unhygienic. Large, elaborate collars and cuffs, like the ruffs popular in the 17th century, also made eating with your hands a messy and difficult proposition. A fork helped keep your expensive, fashionable clothes clean. It was a practical solution to a new problem created by fashion. Slowly, the fork's status began to shift. What was once seen as effeminate and pretentious started to be seen as elegant and sophisticated. It became a marker of high social class. If you used a fork, it showed you were wealthy, well-traveled, and up-to-date with the latest trends. As the aristocracy adopted it, the rising middle class sought to imitate them. The fork became an aspirational object. By the late 1700s, the fork was common, though not yet universal, among the upper and middle classes in Europe. The four-tined, curved design that originated in Italy had become the standard. It was now a truly useful and versatile tool, able to spear, scoop, and cut soft foods. Well, it took until the 19th century, with the advent of mass production during the Industrial Revolution, for forks to become cheap enough for almost everyone to own. It was only then that the fork truly completed its journey from a despised foreign novelty to an essential part of daily life for ordinary people. So, did medieval people eat with forks? The answer is a clear no. For the vast majority of people during the entire medieval period, the fork was either completely unknown or was an object of suspicion and ridicule. They had a perfectly good system for eating with their hands, spoons, and knives. The story of the fork is not a medieval story. It's a story of the Renaissance and the early modern period. It's a story about changing ideas of class, cleanliness, and civilization, a story that shows how even the most ordinary object on our table can have a long and surprisingly controversial history.